Well, for my final entry, I wanted to kind of look upon teaching forms of, and conventions, I suppose, and how those might be changing. There was an interesting term which leapt out of one of the reports that was discussed over the course of this module, which is folk pedagogy. This term implies a kind of tradition which has developed in higher education, particularly in the UK, as opposed to other countries like Germany, where pedagogy is a kind of serious discipline which academics can study in a formal sense and are often required to do so. In the UK we've developed a different tradition, perhaps a more pragmatic Anglo-Saxon type of tradition, whereby we, to a greater or lesser extent, do as has been done to us in the past, that traditions develop in a less formal way. We recall the way that we were taught as undergraduates, and we repeat some of those behaviours, perhaps embroider them, perhaps enhance them in some way, perhaps transform them in some way in the light of new knowledge, new ways of doing things, but essentially pass on a tradition that goes back many centuries. And one can see this in the traditional forms that campus-based university education takes. The lecture, essentially what I'm delivering just now, a monologue to an audience, largely one way, imparting of information, thoughts, ideas, and so on. The cornerstone of much university education. Other traditional and less traditional forms have developed. Tutorials, one-to-one communication between the lecturer and the student, or seminars where a group of students come together to discuss some ideas, facilitated and or led by either the teaching staff or the students themselves. And within those traditional teaching forms, and forms of assessment as well, like examinations, essays and so on, other technologies and techniques have been incorporated or layered upon these more traditional academic forms. So some of the examples that have been talked about over the past 5 weeks would include things like the PowerPoint slideshow as a kind of skeleton or framework to hang a lecture around, an augmentation of that, and beset with its own difficulties. The overuse of text and whiz-bang effects, the way that it might tend to become more like a script for the presentation and determine its shape too much. The use of virtual learning environments, they're dedicated secure websites that students log into simply as a repository, simply as a substitute for traditional photocopied or printed handouts. So documents that are otherwise fairly traditional in their format are stored there and can be downloaded by the students. These kind of approaches kind of bolt on certain useful aspects of technology which replace earlier forms, so that the the PowerPoint replaces traditional photographic slides. The VLE replaces a whole plethora of printed information on paper. So they're just kind of electronic facsimiles of what has gone before, to a large extent. And there was another idea that I thought was quite interesting that kind of links into this notion of folk pedagogy, is the idea of blended learning, which is a piece of jargon that leapt out at me as something that could be looked into further. And one of the things that interested me about this term is that I wasn't quite sure what it meant. As I subsequently discovered, it has no hard and fast definition, but essentially it's about a hybrid form sitting somewhere between completely electronic e-learning, which is delivered entirely using technological platforms, and the traditional face-to-face established norms of the university or other educational institution. So it hybridizes elements of these two facets of educational practice. And this is, in some senses, where I position my own teaching efforts, kind of, on that spectrum, probably more towards the electronic side of things. Although I'm a strong believer in the benefit of face-to-face contact, and I think that the evidence shows that students value this also. That actually direct contact with teaching staff is an important way of not only getting information across, but also having a dialogue, having a discourse going on between the lecturer and the student body and the learner. But this notion of hybridized form, this blended learning approach, really fits with the way that I see possibilities to extend traditional teaching practice, and I've already done so to some extent in terms of asking students to work on online blogs as an assignment instead of traditional essays, for example. Obviously using the VLE primarily as a repository. It would be interesting to look into that further to see what other ways Blackboard could be used to extend learning possibilities. I think particularly interesting for things like peer learning and peer communication, peer review, outside of a constructed opportunity within a physical teaching space. I think those possibilities are quite interesting, and I personally haven't explored them sufficiently. There's maybe a question there in terms of how traditional pedagogy can evolve. What are there are implications there of the use of new technologies that we've seen impacting on certain aspects of the delivery of traditional forms, such as the impact of software like PowerPoint on the form of the lecture, for example, the impact of the VLE on the distribution of course materials. What are the potential impacts of wider use of electronic media forms on teaching, and and what are the difficulties? What could we possibly lose as a result of going further down this road? To some extent, being on this course has illustrated some of the potentials there, and I think one of the most powerful things that I've seen happening through this module is this sense of building a learning community, which is familiar to many of us who are regular internet users. That idea of an online community of interest. That's very well supported by the notion of people taking part in a particular course at a particular time and having conversations amongst each other and exchanging knowledge and therefore learning from each other. I think that is certainly something that could be explored further. In times when institutions are looking at resources that are stretched much more thinly in terms of staffing, some of those online interactions can start to replace traditional seminars, for example. But what are the potential pitfalls of moving activities like that online, and how can we safeguard some of the valuable aspects of traditional teaching approaches in the face of the demand of increasing student numbers and increasing pressure to widen access and to put courses online as part of a way of delivering teaching more cheaply. A lot to think about there.